Well, Tom Casperson first went to Lansing in 2002 to represent Upper Michigan's 108th House District. He was elected in 2010 to serve as senator from the 38th District, which includes all of Upper Michigan except 3 eastern counties. He was reelected in 2014. Today, he and his colleagues in Lansing are moving toward the finish line in this year's budget debate. Senator Casperson, welcome back to the Ryan Report.
Good to be back, Don.
You know, I'm going to share a little history with you and with the audience. This is the 350th show I've done in this series.
That's amazing.
There's no magic to that number, but it's a lot of shows. And just, you know, I did the show for about 5 years, took a 6-year break to serve on the Marquette City Commission, and now I've been back for a little over 2 years again, so 350 shows in that time. You were a guest on my show when I first started again 2 years ago. And my closing thought on that show had to do with the fact that you guys were really kind of sending a message to the state and to others on how to work together as a legislative group. And of course, one of the other key members of that group was John Kewala. And now it's been about a month since he passed away, and we haven't had a chance to talk about that, but I know he was a good friend and colleague of yours.
He was. It's still pretty raw. It's still hard to kind of comprehend. Sometimes it doesn't even seem real, you know, that it really happened. But no, everything you said is accurate, and John was, he set a bar, as he would put it, pretty high as far as how we work together. He never said I did it, he said we did it. He always talked in terms of us, you know, the group. And he did set a bar pretty high, and the next people coming in have something to reach for. And that was something John always made a point of, and challenged people that don't let it go, you know, keep it going. The working together, and put the politics aside when it comes time to governing, and John did that. I got colleagues in Lansing that still talk about him, and he really made a mark down there, and he had a way of just working with everybody. He would disagree with you, but that was okay. You know, that wasn't a problem. But he was well respected, not just within his own caucus, but in my caucus as well. And he was a House member coming over to the Senate. And a lot of my colleagues, you know, looked up to John as far as his leadership role and the way he governed. And I hope we can keep some of that going. And I said that, you know, I mentioned that on the floor when we were talking about what happened, that I hope that ultimately this thing doesn't go away. We don't forget John in the sense of what he accomplished, and that maybe out of this, some people could learn something in my business, in the political world, that this is the better approach.
He certainly will be missed. You know, and just over a week ago, we had a situation in Washington where some Republican congressmen came under attack by someone with a rifle. Now, not that this guy represents the mainstream, but are you concerned about the way it's become in this country with the anger and just the way so many people are approaching this political situation?
Yeah, and that gets to the heart of what we just talked about. You know, John was one that put the swords down and worked on issues to try and govern. And I think our constituents could see that, they could feel it. They knew that there was something new in town, that things were working a lot better actually. And that's where I think hopefully there's a way to kind of amplify that and get that out there to show people a different way. I mean, in the last 15, 20 years, to me, it seems like it just keeps growing, that the way to get ahead here, or the way to solve things, is attack the other guy and let everybody know how bad the other person is and how great you are. And that has never flown. You know, as far as I'm concerned, that's not the way to go. But it's been working where you see the pendulum swinging, and the people vote for the other side, and then they get upset with that side, and it swings back the other way. It's going to take a participation not just from the elected officials, but from the public too. They have to participate in this, in the tone, the rhetoric, everything.
Let's talk about one of the big issues in Lansing, and that's the budget. This year, you know, some years the House and Senate were kind of going to it. Obviously, Republicans and Democrats don't agree, but Republicans have been in control. This year, there's been more of an issue between the legislature, Republican leadership, and the governor. And one of the big items, I think it comes down to about $500 million the governor wanted to use for some things, and you guys wanted to use it for something else. And one of those things was pension reform for teachers. What's the issue there?
Well, the issue, I think the argument, and I probably fell with the governor more on this one, was that we had recently passed what we called the hybrid plan. And that was to offset and slow down what was happening with the pension, and that is we're going farther and farther in the hole here. We can't keep up. for a whole variety of factors. One was, you'll hear that John Engler had taken some money years ago and put it somewhere else. Well, my understanding was he took and put it in the insurance fund for the teachers and didn't put it in the pension. He tried to shore up insurance at that time. So there's a legitimate argument to say, well, he shouldn't have done that and maybe that would have helped. But clearly the numbers are large enough to prove that that wasn't the whole problem. We've got an issue going right now. They guaranteed an 8% return on the investment. That hasn't happened, not on an average. So we've fallen short there. Life expectancy was factored into this when they put this plan together. Life expectancy has gone out farther now. So they're not recalibrating, they're just simply trying to keep going with the way it is, the status quo. That's not working, Don. And we're told $29 billion right now is the shortfall that's projected. So we have to shore this up. That's where the hybrid came from, and we said, let's try there. And I just felt like, and I think the governor did too, that we came right back with what you just saw, and that was to totally eliminate the pension altogether for all newcomers. Everybody that's new coming in, nobody gets a chance to get into it, which was the hybrid. It gave them a choice. And so that was the decision. All good reasons because of the problem that's coming, but the governor, I think, was hoping we could give it some time and see how it works before we judge it right out of the gate. I thought the same thing. I thought maybe we should have given it a little more time. That was the reason I voted no. It just seemed like we were moving too fast, because when you pull everybody out of that fund, any newcomer coming in, the cost to the state or to the taxpayer is going to be a pretty large sum, and we got to be careful with it.
Okay. We have to take a break. I'll be back with more questions for Senator Casperson in just 2 minutes. I'm talking this morning with State Senator Tom Casperson. Let's go through a few items quickly. Still on the budget, K-12 and higher education, how are they faring this year?
I think they're doing pretty good. We've kept the X2 formula in there, which gives our lower funded schools double the amount of the foundational allowance. So they're going to get, I think it's upwards of $100 per student, roughly 100 and 120. And then half of that will go to the schools that are at a higher level. And the whole issue behind that is to try and fulfill what really was Proposal A, to close the lower funded schools to the higher funded schools, the gap. And so that was put in there. It looks like that's made it through. So I think it's, you know, we're going in the right direction, the positive direction.
There's a debate in Lansing about funding for corrections, and I think everyone admits Michigan perhaps spends too much money, but there's a concern that perhaps some Republicans want to reduce those numbers too quickly, and the solutions could lead to some safety issues. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I would share those concerns in that I've been assured they're not closing a prison, but I'm also being told by corrections and by, not so much corrections, but my colleagues that are working on their budgets, that the beds, the needed beds are being reduced greatly. So in other words, the population has been dropping for prisons. So that sounds good on the surface, except I've been meeting with my sheriffs in my district. I was up in Houghton, I was over in Ontonagon, I've talked to the folks here in Marquette, I've talked to Delta County, just about any sheriff I can think of, I've been talking to them. And what I'm finding is their population is at high numbers or beyond, meaning critical numbers. And Houghton certainly would be part of that. Ontonagon is struggling with their population, which is growing. So I would question, and I questioned the Senate Appropriations Chair, is there a correlation to some of the things we're doing through sentencing guidelines, letting people out early, the idea of you can't go to prison, it's more of a local offense, so the judges' hands are tied, they're putting them in local jails. I think there might be some of that, Don, and that concerns me. We're shifting the burden to the counties versus the state taking.
And this would not be the first time something like that's happened.
It would not be the first time, but it's not good either, and it's tough on our local units, our sheriff's departments. They're bearing the brunt of some of this, and I'm not going to say it's all of that, but there's just too much of a coincidence what's happening with our local jails.
Big box stores continues to be in the news, failed in the Senate last year. Any hope of something happening this year?
Yeah, I think we're going to try and take a piece of the onion and peel it back one piece at a time. The approach now is that everybody is coming around the table saying, why don't we take on one thing at a time with this thing? And the first thing out of the gate will be the this idea of deed restrictions And not to eliminate the ability for people to use deed restrictions. There's a tool, or it's a tool to be used, but they shouldn't be able to then go use those same buildings for a comparable. So if we just focus on that, that alone would make a big dent in what's going on right now. So that's the hope right now, is take it a piece at a time and run it through that way.
Okay. One of the things we're hearing about in Lansing is doing away with the need for a concealed weapons permit. Good idea or bad?
It's good on the surface if you're a Second Amendment person and you really believe that the government should be limited in their scope of regulating us, especially the law-abiding citizen. This one here has some tentacles in it, though, that are making the people a little bit jittery, including I've talked to some gun clubs that, you know, they're definitely Second Amendment, believe they have the right to carry, and it's the training part of it. And the reason for that is, if we don't require some type of training, then how do we educate folks on the laws that exist in Michigan? Because they're not all the same from state to state. So you lose that opportunity there. Now maybe there's a way we can put together a guide that you get when you purchase a gun, much like you do when you get a hunting license. They tell you what you can and can't do. I think at the bare minimum, if this were to pass, we need something like that. And the other is, because I've gone through the training, and one thing I learned is I hunt, I use guns. I'm not an anti-gun at all. I'm Second Amendment all the way. But I learned something in training, and that was there's more to it than just owning a gun. There's a responsibility that comes in, and there's an adrenaline issue if you were to encounter a problem. And so you learn all that in these classes. So that would be my only concern, that we lose that opportunity to train people that maybe don't have that type of training. But I'm certainly open to letting them carry and letting them have ownership of a gun.
Okay. And one issue that's kind of interesting for those of us in the UP, the possibility that people could be prevented from letting their car run in the winter time in their driveway because of local ordinances.
Yeah, we found that out. A representative from over on the west side of the state introduced legislation, and we took it up in my transportation committee, and I didn't really realize it could be. I mean, It was one of those things you just can't believe it's true, but there was the ability for an ordinance to be put in place that if you went and started the car in the morning, let's say for your wife to go to work, and you wanted to make sure her car was warm in the wintertime, by doing that you were breaking, in a sense, the law, because you had your keys in the ignition, the car was running and the doors weren't locked, you were warming the car up. And so that's been changed. Now it's the only place you can do that is if you're alongside of the highway and you were to leave your keys in the car with the engine running. And quite frankly, I can't figure why anybody would do that and walk away from their car, but I think we did clean that one up.
Okay. We have some other issues to talk about. We'll be back with questions and answers in just 2 minutes. Talking this morning with State Senator Tom Casperson. One of the bills you've worked on is under the heading of land plan reform. In some cases, the state acquiring land is a good thing. You feel that's not always true, right?
Yeah, I think where there's massive ownership, it affects our local units of government heavily, and it really only applies in the Upper Peninsula and northern lower Michigan. You get south of Clare, they really don't own much land anywhere. And that was really what the thrust behind forcing the discussion. Certainly not opposed to them owning land, but I think locals have to have some say here when it really affects them to a large degree. And the question really is, how much do we need?
Is this legislation likely to pass?
Yeah, we're really close. The Senate's ready to vote on it. It's sitting in the Senate right now. We have plenty of votes to move it. We're waiting for the House to do their deliberations. The committee chair is working on it right now, and they're going through the process. They've held hearings. I'm holding on to the bill till I get confirmation from the chairman over there that he's ready, and then we'll send it over to him.
Another issue has been the trust fund, natural resource trust fund grants. And I think we could all agree, again, this is a good program. But, and the grants come from mineral leases, mainly oil and gas, used for recreational purposes. But this year, what happened? The Senate decided to offer some additional grants?
Yeah, actually, they didn't. What they did was they had the scored projects that scored very well that the trust fund left out, and for some reason didn't want to fund those programs. The Senate included those programs. So they only included programs that the trust fund themselves have scored very high. And the reason that's relevant is because the trust fund also approved some projects that scored very low. In fact, so low, they were below the threshold that they set for themselves. And there was about, I believe, 7 projects, maybe a little bit more, that scored low. And they got funded while these other projects that scored very high were left out hanging. So the Senate said, wait a minute, you have more than enough money in the pot to pay for all the projects. So we didn't try to challenge them on the projects that scored really too low to be qualified, in our opinion. We went along with that, but we said, why are you leaving these other people out there hanging? You've already scored them. You've, in a sense, said they scored very well. Let's approve them. So that's where the debate is.
And where's that going to wind up?
It's going to be somewhere in the middle, because there's 2 issues here. One is, does the legislature have the authority to approve projects? We are, they're saying, the trust fund's saying, we are the ones that have the authority to approve. You can throw them out, you can disapprove, but you can't approve projects. So the constitutional debate is there, but the other side of that equation, where I think we've certainly gotten the trust fund's attention, is the trust fund board, is they're putting together they've been storing money up in what's called a stabilization fund. There's nowhere in the Constitution that says they can do that. That's over and above the $500 million corpus that was met. So that's really where the debate's coming in. And in this case, they had plenty of money to fund all the projects, but instead of funding them, they took a big chunk of it and put it into this, what they call stabilization fund, which has reached almost $80 million. Okay. And so if they would have funded everything, they still would have had money left over and could have put it into the stabilization fund, but we're challenging the authority to even have the fund.
We have only about a minute left, but you got involved with a man named Roy Hinkson. What happened to Roy?
Roy had a camp. He has a camp over in the Hiawatha. He has 40 acres. Found out there's a boundary problem. The camp is built over on Hiawatha forest land. It went over the boundary. Some might say, well, then he shouldn't be there. Well, except for the fact that it's 65 years old, that family owning that camp. And it was the Forest Service since 1976, after the camp had burned, asked him to move the camp because they thought he was close to the boundary, and they said, would you move it? And he put it right where they wanted. And so now we have this, with GPS, we can get it right on. Forest Service found out the camp is on Forest Service land, so we believe what they should have done is traded land to fix the problem, or sell him probably up to 6-7 acres would have solved it. And instead, they want him to tear it down, and in their words, restore everything, which was, I read through it, it was crazy what they wanted him to do. He's been in court several times now. A federal judge has now ruled in Roy's favor and actually used words like, anybody could think this is absurd thinking. That's how the judge ruled. I can't thank that judge enough for using some common sense and actually dug into this thing and found out what they were doing. So I hope they resolve this. It needs to be resolved on. He's a citizen. He's a Vietnam veteran. He served his country honorably. He's an honorable man. And this needs to be resolved, and there's no reason the Forest Service doesn't fix it.
And this is a case where there was a simple solution, just a matter of doing it. So,
yep. And
you've also appealed this to Washington.
We have.
Okay. We're out of time this morning. Thanks for coming in. Appreciate it very much. I didn't get to all of my questions. There's so much going on in Lansing. We'll have to do it again soon.
Sounds good. Thanks for having me down.
Okay.